Pastor Scott here. Welcome back. And we're looking today at God's providence as we continue to walk through Thomas Watson's A Body of Divinity. Well, what is God's providence? Why don't we start there? Well, God's works of providence, as the Shorter Catechism says, are the acts of his most holy, wise, and powerful government of his creatures and of their actions. So we've already talked about the decree of God. God has planned all things. We talked about the creation of God. He's set the stage on which his decree or his plan can be played out. Providence is referring to God's actually carrying out his decree, carrying out his plan in time and space. You make a blueprint for a house and then you actually build the house, right? In that analogy, providence would be the building part. The decree would be the blueprint part. And so that's providence. And so Watson here, he talks about the foreordaining when he talks about the decree, the plan beforehand. And then with providence, he likes to use the language of ordering or government, all right, governing, as the Shorter Catechism says. So that's what providence is. It's God's carrying out his plan. It's his governance of all of his creation, all of his creatures. And I love how very quickly Watson talks about this really foundational, important implication of this teaching of God's providence. And here's a little quote from him. He says, "There is no such thing as blind fate, but there is a providence that guides and governs the world." And he quotes then also from Proverbs, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." We live in a world that is set up, right, decreed, created by God, and is currently ordered, right, providentially by a personal being, a tripersonal being, the triune God, right? That's the world that we live in. And as Christians, we have to imagine the world that way and live in the world in that way. So God is not like a builder who builds the house, but then leaves and has nothing to do with the house. Instead, God is more like, a better analogy, Watson says, he's more like a pilot who steers the ship. Right? He's intimately involved in what's going on. Now, a lot of people would say, well, okay, I can grant that God's providence is part of, the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Okay, that special providence of his virgin birth. He's part of the life of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the crucifixion and the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Right, I'm okay with that. I'm okay even with him providentially governing all of the all of the activities of King David and all of the various figures of the Old Testament and even the New Testament. But outside of that, really, how far does God's providence reach? And Watson says, look, God's providence reaches to all places. All right, so he talks about the heavens, the earth, the sea, all persons. He talks about unbelievers and believers alike. And he does say, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a special providence, a special care for God's people, for his church. And he says all occurrences. So yeah, that means in the government, right? Political occurrences are under God's providence. So should Christians talk about politics? Well, we kind of have to, we have to say that politics are within the realm of our Christian world view. It's within, at the very least we can say that, it's within the purview. There is no artificial divide between, well, politics is beyond the realm of what we can talk about in religion over here. That's not really a Christian perspective, and Watson would certainly not view it that way. So yeah, it reaches all places, and some would object, and they'd say, well, but doesn't this actually ruin the reputation of God, because I look around and, as he puts the objection, as Watson does, he says, there are many things done in the world which are very disorderly and irregular. And surely God's providence is not in these things. This isn't Watson's opinion, of course. This is Watson saying you might have this objection. And then, of course, he's going to shoot the objection down. And he has this great little illustration. He says, suppose you were in a smith's shop and should see several sorts of tools. All right, some crooked, some bowed, others hooked. Would you condemn all these things because they do not look handsome? The smith makes use of them all for doing his work. Thus it is with the providences of God. He gives examples. God will sometimes bring his people low, his beloved people. He'll bring them low. He'll bring them into a humble, a lowly, a place of suffering, a place of persecution, a place of torment, right? He does this, and Watson says, as an example, here's this crooked, bowed instrument, and yet God uses it. And he's got this great quote. He says, for instance, in times when people are brought low, God's people, he says, quote, if it were always sunshine, we should see no stars. And that really gets to the point of, in our suffering, God does draw near to his people, and there's blessings that come even in times of suffering. So there's an example of God providentially using suffering, but he's carrying out still his providence. He's carrying out his decree in time and space, which is a good decree, a holy decree, a wise decree. He gives another example of one of these crooked tools that God nevertheless uses in his providence. He says the wicked flourish. You look at wicked people, they're doing great. Well, sometimes, he says, one example is God exalts wicked men to do his work even against their will. So God will use wicked men. He'll exalt them, like he exalted the Babylonians, to do God's work of judgment, of God's work of bringing a curse upon the Judeans and the Israelites for their covenantal disobedience. He uses the wicked, brings them up. This doesn't make even the prophets very happy, right? Habakkuk thinks, how could this be so? But God says, no, I'm carrying out my will. I'm carrying out my providence, and there is a good, a wise, a holy reason for it, even if it's not clear to you. So we shouldn't look at the providences of God and say, well, they're not what I would expect. They're not how I would work. Well, God is a master workman, and he knows exactly what he's doing. Well, then Watson, and I have to go through some of these because they're just so well done and they're profound. But there's some other lessons that we want to highlight here from this doctrine of God's providence. One would be providences which appear accidental to us are actually predetermined by the Lord. And he even gives kind of mundane examples as well as biblical examples. He says, the falling of a tile on one's head seems like an accident. Seems right. But even that little thing, that's part of God's larger web of his providence. The breaking out of a fire seems like just an accident. Seems like maybe an accident of nature. What maybe it wasn't caused by a human, but we think, lightning struck or what have you. No, this is part of God's plan, God's providence. He gives biblical examples like 1 Kings 22:34. A certain man drew a bow at a venture and smote the king of Israel. Some good King James type stuff there. But yeah, so here's this example of this random soldier sort of accidentally killing the king of Israel. Well, no, it wasn't an accident. That's very clear in the text, right? This is being communicated by the text of Scripture. God's providence. God is in control of all of these events, all of these occurrences. God's providence reaches it all. Another lesson we learn from God's providence is we should observe and learn wisdom from God's providence. We should look at what God does, look at how he works, and we grow in wisdom as we interact with the world around us. This is part of how experience helps us to grow in wisdom. But Watson so wisely here says, but we are not to make this the rule of our actions. Now, what does he mean? We look at God's providence around us. Remember those crooked or bowed instruments or tools that he uses. We're going to see things like, somebody who's sinful and has success from their sin. We shouldn't look at that and think, well, I should do that. I should be sinful and I'll get success too. Some people do this. This is sort of the sinful worldly wisdom that people will have. People will be wise as serpents, but not innocent as doves. They'll be the opposite of innocent. They'll be guilty. This is something Christians need to hear this, right? This is such a good lesson, and it's so well put by Watson. He says this, quote, "Providence is a Christian's diary, but not his Bible." Okay, I think that's so good. Providence is a Christian's diary. We can learn from it. We can observe and learn things. But the rule, the standard that is always to be guiding our behavior and guiding our interpretation and response to God's providence must be his holy word, which is the only rule of faith and life, as our Westminster Standards will say. Another few lessons here. God is to be trusted when his providence seems to run contrary to his promises. And so, for instance, David is anointed, he's going to be king, but then the current king, Saul, is running after him, trying to kill him. Well, God, what are you doing here? I thought I was supposed to be king. You said that I would be, and now I might die because of this crazy King Saul. Well, David, in that time, needed to trust the Lord and his providences, to be wise, but to trust that God's promises would indeed come true. And of course they did. Another lesson, God's providences in this world, in this fallen world under sin, right? This world, as Solomon would put it, under the sun, is filled with mixed providences. What do we mean by that? Well, Watson says, in hell, there will be nothing but bitter providences. In heaven, nothing but sweet providences. But in this life, the providences of God are mixed. There is something of the sweet in them and something of the bitter. We talk about hard providences, bitter providences. I think that's fair to say. So I've heard people respond and say, well, no, we shouldn't say that because this is still a providence of God. So is it condemning God to call it a bitter or a hard providence? I don't think that it is. I think it's a way not to, of course, if you're accusing God, yeah, that's wrong. But it's a way not to accuse God, but to recognize, again, very much in an Ecclesiastes or Job manner, to recognize that this is real suffering, this is real hardship, there is real bitterness to this. But also, yes, it's a providence of God, it's part of God's decree, and so we know that this is ultimately going to work out for the good of those who love him, as Romans 8 would say. One more lesson before we move on to our uses. The same action as it comes from God's providence may be good, and as it comes from men may be evil. And so we want to be careful. Joseph's brothers, they meant it for evil, right? Them selling Joseph into slavery, all of that interaction with Joseph, that was them doing something wrong. They were guilty of that. They were culpable, responsible for their actions. Their intentions were evil. And yet God ordained this. God permitted this to carry out this way. He carried this out in his providence. God, though, he meant it. He intended it for good. And indeed, it did have good purposes. And we get to see that in the latter portion of the book of Genesis, in how God preserved his people through the evil actions of these brothers, and how he, of course, blessed Joseph and exalted Joseph very highly. Well, this moves us to the three uses of the doctrine of providence. So let's run through this here real quick. The first one is exhortation, and then he gives us 5 ways that this exhorts us, teaches us. We are to admire God's providences. We're to learn to submit to God's providences. Easier said than done. The third one, believe that all God's providences are for your good at last. Right? They may taste a bit bitter now, but we do trust that they are good at last, for our good at last. Number 4, let it be an antidote against immoderate fear that nothing comes to pass, but that what is ordained by God's decree and ordered by his providence. I love this point. We are often tempted into sinful and immoderate fear, and immoderate is lack of moderation. It's too much. We're too fearful. Another word that we might want to use there is inordinate, right? That it's out of order, that our fear of God should come before this other fear. And so this is a great remedy to sinful fear, immoderate fear, inordinate fear. Number 5 is going to be thankful for God's merciful providence that keeps us alive and fed. Thank God for your food. Thank God for your breath. Thank God for everything. The second use is comfort. Comfort for God's church. I mentioned before, Watson believes in what's called special providence. And what he means by that is that God has a special care for his people, for his church. So he gives this example with the Israelites. He says, God led them by a pillar of fire, gave them manna from heaven, water from the rock. He didn't do that with other peoples, but he did this with them. He gave them his ordinances, right, for salvation. He gave his people something unique, something special in his providence. And he continues to do that today. As we come into the church, we are blessed by the worship of God, his word. We're blessed by prayer and intimacy with the church, the people of God, the fellowship of God. And so there's many blessings that come through that. So there's special providence, special care that God has for his church. Third, long for the time when the great mystery of God's providence will be fully unfolded to us. What a sweet time that will be when we're able to, in the new creation, when we enter into glory, that God will unveil, will show us, hey, that suffering that you went through, that actually was part of working out the salvation of my beloved people. That was for their good. It was something that was holy and wise and blessed and wonderful and good. It didn't feel like that in the moment. You weren't able to comprehend it, but here's how these things worked out. And Watson believed that the Lord would give his people something of an unfolding of his providence when they enter into glory. And I think that is a good hope, I think, to look forward to as we go through challenges, those bitter providences in life. Well, there you go. There is the doctrine of providence, and we'll keep on moving through this book next week when we're back together. We'll see you then.